Well, good evening and welcome to the Centre for Independent Studies. My name is Tom Switzer. I'm the Executive Director here at CIS. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here this evening. I know the weather is most inclement, so thank you so much for coming tonight. As you no doubt know, CIS has for many years, going back to the mid to late 1970s, we've been unashamed advocates of economic reform. And when you hear economic reform, it's not a politically sexy subject, but it's a very important subject. It's about putting in place market-oriented policies to help boost productivity and growth. And it's a tough sell politically. I think this has been quite evident since John Hewson's election loss in 1993. But the cold hard reality is that economic reform, especially during that 25-year golden age under Hawke and Keating and Howard and Costello, in many respects they put in place policies that helped set the scene for the 27 years of uninterrupted economic growth. And I think that it helps to recognise that things like deregulating the financial markets, floating the dollar, slashing import protection, cutting income company taxes, monetary policy independence, competition policy, privatisation, deregulation, all of those policies were widely controversial at the time, but they did produce what many people regard as the world's miracle economy. Little known fact, but from the mid-1980s until the end of the commodities boom in 2011-2012, we had real wage growth. We had the largest incomes boom since the gold rushes, an extraordinary period of prosperity. We'll be talking about that period, but also what it means for the country going forward, given that there has clearly been reform fatigue in Canberra for a very long period of time. There is no question that one of this country's leading advocates of economic reform is my next speaker. Michael Stutchbury is the Editor-in-Chief of the Australian Financial Review, has been so for several years now. Before that, he was the editor of the Australian newspaper. I can only think of one other person who's been the editor of the two national flagships in this country, and that was Max Newton. I think there's a distinction that one should draw between Max Newton and Michael Stutchbury. We won't go there tonight. But Michael Stutchbury has been a leading supporter of economic reform in this country for more than 3 decades, and it's a great pleasure to welcome him here to CIS.
Thanks, Tom. It's a real pleasure and an honour to be here launching Peter Hendy's important new book, and to be at the CIS with Tom Switzer, who have worked with at both the Australian and the Financial Review, and really thrilled to see Tom taking the reins at the CIS and taking one of Australia's great think tank institutions to a new higher level. Now, I'm here to launch Why Australia Slept. Is Australia sleepwalking its way into the future? And I think there's the genre of Peter Hendy's book, and we'll hear from him in first person in a while, owes a lot to the personal history of the author. It's a history of a career in economics, policy making and politics, from a young Treasury official tutoring Andrew Peacock on economics, the hard jobs, amongst others, through to the other extreme of advising John Hewson on Fight Back, with a bit of Peter Reith in defence and a bit of IR warrior with Peter Reith, with Brendan Nelson. No doubt there's a bit of Switzer connection there, and then even onto Julie Bishop. So just about the whole rock and roll heaven there line up that you've advised. Along the way, he's been a lobbyist for business associations, even had a stint in economic development in the Middle East, and even if being a politician tripping over TV camera cables in shopping centres is not his natural calling, he also had a stint as being in a marginal seat, a marginal Liberal MP. I think he provided the Queanbeyan lounge room party pies for the MP conspirators who ended up putting him out in turmoil with it. Then, after a brief stint tripping over the TV camera cables, he lost his seat sadly in 2016, but became the Chief Economics Advisor to the new Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull. And now, as I understand, hanging out his own shingle and writing books. So this is a book about, I think very much reflects the author and his history. And I think it's a terrific thing for people to come up through Treasury, go into policy making, go into politics and really contribute to public life like this. And this is a book about economic history, from the well-known story of the Australian Federation to now and beyond. So it's about how Australia's Federation settlement of high import protection for an infant manufacturing industry, heavy regulatory intervention in the labour market to support Australia's labour unions, and a White Australia policy to keep out competition from cheap imported Asian or Islander labour. And it's about how this Australian settlement from the Federation after generations gave way to what Peter calls the Australian Settlement 2.0. You say 2.0?
I do.
Which from the 1970s and particularly the 1980s dismantled these key pillars of the original settlement. Now, a lot of this is told through the prism of business associations such as the Chambers of Manufacturers, the Chambers of Commerce and the Business Council of Australia, so there's a bit of heavy research I think into the history of business associations. And this settlement, and in the book, the Settlement 2.0 or zero, can be traced back to the Whitlam government's 25% tariff cut, to the pre-Whitlam winding back of the White Australia policy under coalition governments, and the Campbell Committee report into the financial system under Howard Fraser. But, of course, particularly to the really big opening up of the economy under Hawke Keating, followed by some Howard Costello. It's a well-known story, but I think it's worth retelling from this vantage point. And it's good to hear terms such as microeconomic reform and economic rationalism still being thrown around. Now it's sometimes called neoliberal economics and often intended as a term of abuse. And from my point, it's satisfying to see, not satisfying, but maybe slightly jolting to see one's own that it mirrors one's own professional career, and even sees a quote from oneself back in the 1980s represented there. So it's been a short time, but a long time. And then the story goes on to the Sleepwalking End of Crisis thesis. Now, basically, this is how the prosperity generated by the productivity payoff from the reforms of the 1980s and 90s, and then the unexpected bonanza of the China boom has morphed into today's complacency. And as we know, there's been no major productivity enhancing policy reform that has been sustained since Howard's GST in 2000. That's getting on to 2 decades and about as long as some of the young CISs have been around on this earth. And the question becomes, is 2.0 degenerating into something less prosperous? Are we going through another long cycle of bad policy which will end up at crisis at some time, hopefully prompting a new productivity policy consensus and hopefully not the Beijing consensus? And the news story, the big news story in Peter's book, and the one we put on page 1 of the Financial Review, goes back to what he says about how politicians in recent times, including himself, have contributed to this risk of sleepwalking into crisis. And first, if I could make a point about the cycles of economic history, including in an area not necessarily fully covered in the book. The Financial Review campaigned against the Royal Commission into banking and other financial sector misconduct. But in a business news sense, the Banking Royal Commission has been the best thing that's ever happened. It's like Brexit for the FT, or Trump for the New York Times, or the Washington Post. And to recognise these long cycles in Australian political history, it might be worth going back to the previous Banking Royal Commission, not covered in the book in great detail. In 1935, Joe Lyons' government had a Banking Royal Commission forced on it by Labor and by rebel Country Party members, much like Turnbull had the Banking Royal Commission forced on him in 2017 when the revolting Queensland Nationals jumped the fence during that period when Barnaby was out of office because of the bizarre dual citizenship crisis. Now, that Royal Commission back from 1935 through to 1937 was more of a commissioning of inquiry that set up the idea of central banking and Keynesian demand management for the post-war period. And it included Ben Chifley, He was on that, who wrote a dissenting report, and by 1947 Chifley was back in Parliament as Labor Prime Minister, who sought to nationalise the banks, leading of course to a massive defeat in the 1949 election and leading to the whole Menzies era. Finally, Peter's most newsworthy point, and the one we put on page 1 of the Financial Review, goes to his time as a Liberal member for Eden-Monaro. As Liberal member in a marginal seat, he recounts in this book that he argued against a big GST-based tax reform package. The idea that you'd increase the GST, broaden the base, shift the burden onto indirect tax, and then bring down direct taxes, income tax, and sharpen incentives and get growth going. Now, partly, as he says in the book, this is due to the politics. And he agreed at the time with Turnbull's decision to go against Scott Morrison and to take the GST tax reform package and federal state financial reform for that matter off the table by early 2016. It was quite a shock at the time for those who were following the story closely. Suddenly it was on the table, everything was on the table, and suddenly it was off the table. Now, the policy argument was that the numbers no longer added up. There were so many people on the drip, this is the argument, that would need compensation for GST increases to the cost of living, and that would leave too little money over to cut income tax and get the incentive effects. But the political argument was really buttressed by, I think, the searing experience of the Abbott-Hockey 2014 budget, the first budget after Peter got elected in the 2013 election. And this is where the budget, the 2000 budget, where of course Joe Hockey claimed and declared that the era of entitlement was over and the age of personal responsibility had begun. So I ask us here, has any politician in Australian life ever been so wrong? The era of entitlement, of course, was not over. Rather than the end of the age of entitlement, we're digesting Labor's big spending monuments, entitlements on schools, health and disability services. And rather than everybody contributing to fixing Labor's budget mess, as Hockey's budget articulated, everyone was going to contribute, the whole political debate has been reframed around fairness, supercharged with the lefty populism and attacks on the big banks, Malcolm's rich mates and the so-called big end of town. There's one Hawke Keating-era iconocrat said to me just the other day, fairness is just a rebranding of entitlement. So Turnbull and Cormann swept big tax reform off the table, and Turnbull and ScoMo swept it off the table and put up the white flag on Labor's spending monuments. And Peter's big news-making point, though, is this. Sure, big policy reforms can be controversial, but not making the big policy reforms can also end up being politically costly. And in hindsight, Peter traces Turnbull's sharp fall in the polls from those stratospheric levels that he was after September 2015, the sharp fall by the middle of 2016, and of course the near disaster of the mid-2016 election, to public disappointment that Turnbull was not living up to his promise to lead, to reframe the economic narrative and to make the hard calls required to maintain Australian prosperity. And how's this turning now? How's it turning out now? Well, I think the government and the Prime Minister have got a bit of luck with the mini recovery in iron ore, coal and LNG prices, a stronger global economy, pumped up a little bit by the Trump tax cuts. And after hoisting the white flag on Labor spending, Turnbull, ScoMo and Cormann, what they're doing now is they're testing voters' willingness to pay for it through tax increases. And it turns out that the squeeze on household incomes and the increased leveraging, all this borrowing, means that voters aren't that keen, as it turns out, on paying more tax. They're not necessarily all that keen on cutting government spending on schools and hospitals, but don't necessarily want to pay a lot more tax for it. And so the entitlement versus individual responsibility debate is now being reframed from fairness versus lifters to fairness versus aspiration. And the encouraging thing, as even Pauline Hanson points out, as would Donald Trump, is that Labor can't promise fair income tax cuts now for police officers, nurses, school teachers, fireys or tradies earning close to six figures, because that, if you're going to change the tax scales around there, it's going to flow up to people on 200,000 or 300,000, and they're going to get bigger tax cuts. And that just can't be fair by definition. So they're trapped and they can't give genuine tax reform and can't give tax cuts. So now we're seeing the struggle, which will go through the next election, of the fairness debate, we can't cut government spending, through to the aspiration debate of we need to cut taxes to get the economy going again. So the lesson I draw from this and from Peter's main point is that no doubt policymakers, policy reformers such as Peter, need to choose their timing. You've got to know when to really be bold. You've got to know when to do a bit of rope-a-dope on the ropes. But I think when you've got an opportunity, when the stars are aligned, when you've just been when you've been re-elected, when you've got a lot of popularity, I think you really should try and move the debate forward and really strike rather than retreat. And I'm sure that's a lesson that Peter will give to us tonight. So, but with that, I think it's my honour to launch the book and to welcome Peter to the stage.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was a tour de force, and basically you went through the whole book, so I don't even I saw the other day that the most popular books that are being sold in Australia today are cookbooks, and so that's why I'm calling this a recipe book for public policy. And it's got, as Michael was saying, it's basically divided into two parts. The first part is a history basically since Federation up until basically the end of the Howard government, and how we moved from that, as he said, high protection, heavily regulated industries, white Australia policy, restricted immigration, which was called by Paul Kelly, Mike Kelly's on my... I can never get rid of it. He's the guy who beat me. So Paul Kelly, let's get this right. Paul Kelly described, this is the Australian settlement, those protectionist, heavily regulated set of policies that we had, that was set up at Federation by Alfred Deakin, who was actually a Liberal Prime Minister, and that was set up, and it stayed the course for many, many years until essentially in the 1970s Australia began to, in relative terms, go backwards in its wealth, its living standards compared to the other countries in the OECD. And while the business community had supported Alfred Deakin in setting this up all those years earlier, and they had argued to maintain it throughout the decades, by the 1970s and 1980s, the business community, which is what they almost always want to do, were mugged by reality and realised that this was the wrong policy setting for Australia. And so they argued for, and the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry and bodies like that, the Business Council of Australia, but also groups like the CIS and the IPA, were very instrumental in arguing for a change in direction. The business community supported that, and there was a change, and that's what I call the neoliberal consensus. So as you said, it's a term that is as you said, it's a term that's often used as abuse by the lefties. But I, if they think it's a good term, I'll use it. And it's basically descriptive of a new liberal agenda. And so that's what was implemented. I've called it, because this is the type of buzzword you use nowadays, Australian Settlement 2.0, but you can call it a neoliberal agenda. And it isn't the Beijing consensus that is currently being espoused by President Xi over in China. It's something very different, and it's what we need for this country. And a theme of the book, and what Michael in his editorial in the Financial Review picked on the book, was that the business community has a very important role in arguing for the maintenance of this agenda, for arguing for a continuation and an expansion of the agenda, because that will support our lifestyles into the future. And why do we do that? To talk some boring economics, it's about productivity. And people say, Australia's doing quite well. A week or two ago we had the latest national accounts figures. They were tracking around 3%, which is pretty good. And so what's the problem? Well, the problem is that those national account figures, the recent ones, have been propped up by a rebound in our terms of trade and a very high immigration policy, which I do have a talk about. And the issue that we have, however, is that productivity growth is now below long-term trends. And productivity, as a famous Nobel Prize winner once said, productivity isn't everything, but it almost is everything. And if for an economy, and if people are complaining about no wages growth, that's a productivity agenda issue. So I have chapters on tax policy, I have chapters on industrial relations, on trade policy, and then I also write a little bit about international trade and defence, and this might come out in the panel discussion. The last thing I want to comment on before we get down to the more serious discussion with Tom is the name. So the book is Why Australia Slept. Many of you will probably know that John F. Kennedy famously wrote a book in which he talked about why England slept in the lead up to the Second World War in 1939. Why was it that England had governments that were appeasers, if we want to use the terminology of the day, in terms of the Nazi menace? And the interesting thing that he comes to a conclusion on is two things. One is, well, the reason was because the population kept on electing governments that had these policies. And he comes to the important second part of his conclusion, which is that whose fault was this? Whose fault was this? Was it the politicians? Were they just hopeless? And the answer he came to was it wasn't just the politicians. You couldn't blame politicians. This is what John Kennedy said. He said it was in a democracy, it was the population as a whole. Everybody has a role to play, arguing for good policy. In this case, standing up to the Nazis, but in my case, talking about economic reform. And it's quite interesting that in his famous inaugural speech in 1961, he had the same theme. If you think back to that famous phrase, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, it's the same theme. It's about responsibility of individual citizens in arguing for something important, and that's what I think this book's about. So thank you very much.
It's a great pleasure to move a vote of thanks to Michael and Peter for that stimulating discussion. I was making notes during it and putting them in order of interest, and at least in my interest, and I just was reading them over before I got up here, and my top one is to ask Michael what sexual adventures you can get up to with your phone.
Ask the young people.
Might wait for after the meeting for that. If Australians are really sleepwalking into the future, then Peter's book is certainly a wake-up alarm for anyone who reads it, and for someone who's worked at the highest level of the government. Listening to the discussion this evening and also reading the book, it came to me that there were really three vital questions raised there. First was, why do governments in the first place implement policies that impose net costs on society? Why do such policies persist even when people know that there are better alternatives available? And why do some inefficient policies eventually get replaced, while others seem to endure forever and ever? And it seems, reading the book, and nothing I heard tonight changed it, that the answer to all of these questions is politics. And I thought, well, maybe we should end this with a kind of optimistic story. So here's my best optimistic story about policy change. It's from my home state of Western Australia. For 70 years, the West Australian government supported an organisation called the Potato Marketing Corporation, the PMC. And the PMC determined who could grow potatoes, what kind of potatoes they can grow, how many, and what they can sell them for. And as you can imagine, there's some value in this for the growers. In fact, all of the benefits of this scheme flowed to the growers of potatoes. And all the deadweight costs of it were distributed among all the sort of potato consumers of Western Australia. And of course, none of them knew that they were paying these costs. And in all the years of its existence, no government, not Liberal, not Labor, ever tried to abolish the PMC. And they all realized, they weren't stupid, they knew that the PMC was ridiculous, it was unfair, it was wasteful, it was inefficient, but they also knew that the growers would fiercely defend the status quo, and the population as a whole, well, either were ignorant of the whole thing or apathetic and could care less. So why stir up a hornet's nest? Now, according to Milton Friedman, only a crisis, actual or perceived, really leads to change, to real change. And the crisis was actually stirred up by the PMC themselves. What they did is they prosecuted a rebellious farmer for the heinous crime of growing too many potatoes. But they picked on the wrong guy, right? This guy made a lot of noise. First thing he did was give away all his potatoes for free. And he made so much noise that he woke up the sleepwalkers of Western Australia. He got them out of their slumber. And they finally figured out what was going on. So last year, sadly only last year, the PMC was finally wound up. Now, John Stuart Mill said that change happens when the right circumstances meet the right ideas. And ladies and gentlemen, I think you'll agree that Peter Hendy and Michael Stutchbury and Tom all have the right ideas. And let's just hope that we're lucky enough to get the right circumstances to be able to implement them. I want to thank everyone in the CIS who helped to organize tonight's event. And I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking our guests for a very stimulating and thought-provoking